My name is Matthew Miller. I'm the publisher of Koran Jerusalem, which incorporates also our Magid and Toby Press imprints, and we have the distinct pleasure of being the publisher of Rabbi Donner's new book. And I also have the most unnerving responsibility tonight to introduce Rabbi Doner to his own shul, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. But being in publishing, many things don't make sense. The plug, of course, is we publish a wonderful array of titles under our Koran imprint, which is Sidurim, Machzorim, Talmud, the Toby Press, which is cultural, literary, Jewish background, and Magid, which is contemporary Jewish thought, all of which are on sale here, and Hanukkah is coming. That's the plug, that's the commercial plug finished. Now, I can't think of a more appropriate book to make an entirely inappropriate allusion to Rabbi Donner's books. I'm a bit of a classical music nut, and my favorite composer is Mozart. Why? One of the reasons is, like Bach, like Schubert, his music can be serious. It can plunge the soul. It can touch, whether it's the B minor mass or whether it's the symphonies. It can touch our soul. And as Rav Kook once pointed out, he felt that God spoke through Rembrandt, and I think many people think that God spoke through Mozart. But at the same time, he had a wonderful sense of humor. And you can see this in his operas like The Marriage of Figaro or The Escape from the Seraglio. And the inappropriate allusion is that also reminds me of Judaism a little bit. Because as serious as it is, and as much as we must take our beliefs serious, we also shouldn't forget that God laughs with us and God laughs at us. And I think this is something that Rabbi Doner has picked up, and through the exploration of so many rogues and so many less than salubrious, if I could put it that way, characters in Jewish history, and the salubrious ones too, about the Rebbe that comes back to his flock in the most incredible manner, and the wanderings and the mishigas of Trebich, for example. You know, this is a beautifully written, I mean, he is British, so he knows how to write, a beautifully written, engaging book that it's fun, and I commend it to you entirely. Rarely have I read something that brings such joy and such a smile and also makes you glad to be Jewish. And I can't think of a better way than to say, Rabbi Doner, thank you for trusting your work with us, and thank you for inviting us tonight to this, what's going to be a very nice event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matthew. Before we begin the formal program with Professor Marglin, with Jessica, just want to say a few thank yous, if I may. First of all, first and foremost, thank you to Hashem, to God, for enabling me to carry out this new accomplishment, a new level of achievement. I've written hundreds, possibly thousands of articles. It's quite a different thing to write a book and then to get it published. It goes through lots of different levels and layers and people. And when I write an article, I self-edit. Occasionally, one of my assistants reads it, but only to tell me how good it is. And then it gets published. But this is quite a different exercise, and I'm extremely grateful to Hashem for having enabled me in this way. I'd also like to thank the shul staff and volunteers who have created this event this evening, Carly Einfeld, who's been incredible, and Madeline, who's returned with her beautiful baby, and Rose Kemps, one of our volunteers, who is incredibly helpful, and of course, the incomparable Daryl Gay and Sarah Cam, who do so much work for the shul. None of this would be possible without that group of people, and I thank them sincerely for having done what they've done for us, not just tonight, but they do for us all the time. I'd like to thank the team from Koren Publications, the Toby Press. Not all of them are here tonight. Most of them are in Jerusalem. Aryeh is here, and Shlomo is here, and of course Matthew Miller, who's the proprietor and publisher of this incredible publishing house. He's taken it to new levels. He's really done amazing things with Koren Publications, and I don't know how he says he's pleased that I chose them. I am delighted that they chose me, and thank you so much for being with us tonight for this book launch. I'd like to also thank the sponsors of the book. Some of them are here with us tonight, not all of them, because they live all over the world. Robert and Elliot Broidy, Lionel and Ruth Curry, Andrew and Chani Friedman, they're here. Morris and Gabriella Golka, Michael and Cheryl Rosenberg, not sure if they're here yet, but they're going to be here. Lee Sampson, who is here, Mike and Penny Sinclair, and Jackie and Natalie Wiseman, who is here, they're here tonight. Thank you so much for having enabled this publication and being with us tonight. Tonight, I'm dedicating the evening, this event, to Herschel Golker. And those of you who have a book will see that the first dedication in the book by Morris and Gabriella, his son and daughter-in-law, is to Herschel. Very sadly, Herschel Golker was taken ill at the end of Sukkot and passed away a couple of weeks ago. And he never got to see the book. And his son was so eagerly waiting to give him the book. In fact, I sent him a review copy about a month ago in the hope that his father would be able to see it, but he never did. But I'd like to dedicate this evening to his memory. Herschel Golker was a neighbor of mine, of ours, on Hodford Road in London, Golders Green. When I was growing up, he's possibly one of the nicest people I can remember from my youth, a gentle soul. And he passed away, and I just felt that this evening wouldn't be complete without my mentioning him, particularly because he is the first dedication in the book. I'd also like to thank Beverly Hills Synagogue, our shul here, Young Israel of North Beverly Hills, for having hosted and taken part and allowed me to have this event at the shul. It's, as always, a pleasure to have an event in such a wonderful venue. I'm delighted and so happy that I can be the rabbi of this great shul, and that I'm able to showcase some of my work in these four walls, and that this shul can be a host to this wonderful occasion. Finally, I want to tell you that it's very hard to write a book, but it's much harder to be married to someone who's writing a book. And for that reason, I think I owe my greatest thanks to Sabine. And I have bought her a bunch of flowers. It's the least I can do. So if I can give, Sabine has to come up to accept the flowers. I don't think anyone realizes how embarrassing this is for her, but it's the least I can do. You know, if you read the introduction to the book, you'll see that she's an extremely tolerant wife, because even late at night, at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm still tapping away on my laptop as I write articles and droshes and who knows what. And I think that it requires an incredible ezer kenegdoi to enable a husband like me to do the work that I do in the shul and in publishing and in writing and everything. And I owe her a real debt of gratitude. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce you, I'm going to go and sit down in a moment, introduce you to Professor Jessica Marglin, who's here from USC. And she was introduced to me by a mutual friend, David Myers, who's actually a professor of Jewish history. He was the head of the Jewish history department at UCLA. He's back here in LA. He couldn't be here tonight, but he said the perfect person to act as your foil at the launch of your book is Professor Marglin. So it's a great pleasure to introduce her to you, and now I'm going to take my seat.
Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction, although really this evening is about this book and Rabbi Doner. The first thing I want to say is that I accepted this task because David Myers is a good friend and I trust him, and I hadn't yet met Rabbi Doner, and I really didn't, I'd looked at the title of the book, but I didn't read the book, and I accepted, and they sent me the book, and I started reading it, and I literally couldn't put it down. It is that kind of book. It is a page-turner. You may not think that a book called Mavericks, Mystics, and False Messiahs would read like a detective novel, but it does. So for those of you who haven't read it yet, you're really in for a treat. And I really am saying this honestly. I read a lot of books. I'm a professor. That's what I do for a living. Most of them are not page turners, unfortunately. And so I want to start with a question about storytelling. Because Rabbi Doner, when we did meet in person, I was not surprised, but I was also struck by the extent to which you are able to spin a tale, not just on the page, but viva voce, on the fly. I imagine your congregation here gets to benefit from that on a weekly basis, for which I'm very jealous. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you understand the importance of good storytelling. And particularly, not just any story, right? Because we can tell lots of stories, we can tell fictional stories, but this is something that came out of our conversation. What is so important to you about telling a good story about history, about things that actually happened, particularly in Jewish history?
So I am a lover of history, but I grew up reading textbooks and listening to lectures which were thoroughly boring. And of course, I've never heard one of your lectures. I'm sure they're very exciting.
All very exciting.
Most of history is presented to you as facts and figures, and it's very linear, and it never gives the full element, the depth of the drama of the event that's occurring. I remember that when I read Samuel Pepys' diary, and subsequently I read a book about Samuel Pepys, and I don't know how many people here know who Samuel Pepys was. Samuel Pepys was a middle-ranking bureaucrat in London during the time of Oliver Cromwell and Charles II. And he wrote a diary in basically a shorthand version of hieroglyphics. And when he died, this diary was discovered, and it took them quite some time to find the cipher by which it could be interpreted into English. And then it was published, Samuel Pepys' diary. If you've never read it, it's worth looking at. And suddenly you see the history of that period in a completely different light. We always hear of Oliver Cromwell as having been against the monarchy, and he took over Great Britain in those days and beheaded King Charles I, and then eventually he died and his son took over. That wasn't very successful, and they brought back Charles II and the monarchy was reestablished. That's the way it's presented to you in a history lecture. But suddenly, through the eyes of Samuel Pepys, there's such a richness of color and a variety of detail concerning the life of an ordinary person, a middle-ranking bureaucrat who lives in London during this incredible period, where things are, there's a civil war raging, and he's talking about the menu, what he's going to eat for dinner, and who he's met, and, what happened with his wife, and then he had a kidney stone operation, and what that entailed, and he got drunk. There was one occasion where he went to visit a synagogue. The synagogue still exists. It's called Bevis Marks. It's in London. And he couldn't make head or tail of what was going on in the synagogue. He said, I've never seen anything like it. People dancing around, they're half drunk, and people screaming, what's going on here? Of course, no one told him it was Simchas Torah. So, and by the way, the only way you can know that is if you check back the date when Samuel Pepys wrote that particular entry in his diary, and you check it against the date, you discover it was Simchas Torah. Suddenly, it opens up a whole new vista. It's the story of history that's interesting, not necessarily the facts and the details, to know the personalities of the people involved. And what I wanted to do in this book, and what I very much want to do in the articles I write and the speeches I give, is develop the characters of historical figures so you get to know them personally, so you can actually relate to them. They're relatable people. They're just not just names on a page. They're not just details in some linear description of an event that took place. Every personality matters. And by the way, it can be translated into the Talmud. If you begin to understand the personalities of the rabbis in the Talmud, you understand what motivates them to come up with an opinion. Who was Shammai? Who was Hillel? Who was Abaye? Who was Rava? These were real people. They're not just names on a page. Suddenly it brings the Talmud to life. And that's what I love to do. I love to bring history to life.
It's a real gift, I think, to readers, but it's also a gift to be able to do that, because I think, as we discussed, for many academics, we spend a lot of time trying to get those facts and figures right, and we might imagine what these people might have been like in real life, but to actually then convey it is another matter. So it's really to be commended. Speaking of characters and personalities, your book is full of them. In fact, they are overflowing off of the page. And so this connects to something that Matthew alluded to, which has to do with, frankly, the somewhat unsavory characters. Right? You say yourself in the title, from the margins of Jewish history. So you're not, you're not pretending to be talking about, just the great rabbis and all of the great things they did. But I'm curious, because here we are in your shul, Young Israel of North Beverly Hills, right? You are an Orthodox Jew, a rabbi of an Orthodox congregation. You spend your time learning and teaching Torah, and clearly this is connected some ways to your life as a rabbi. But I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure how. How are all of these mavericks and false messiahs, how do they fit in with your role as a rabbi, as a teacher, to educate people about Judaism? Presumably you don't want us to follow the path of Shabbtai Tzvi.
So, first of all, it's an excellent question, and it's not the first time I've been asked this question. What attracts me to unsavory characters and mavericks and false messiahs and some of the crazy people who I write about? And the answer really is that if you want to understand mainstream, you have to look at the extreme. If you really want to understand what drives humanity, you're not going to understand it through observing the ordinary. You're going to understand it through observing the extraordinary. I wrote in my, and we're going to come to him a little bit later on, I'm sure, I wrote in my conclusion about Trebitsch, in the introduction, about Trebitsch Lincoln. So Ignaz Timothy Trebitsch Lincoln was essentially a con man. He was a long-term con man who started off as a Hungarian Orthodox Jew who studied at the Pressburg Yeshiva under the son of the Chassam Sofer, and then he became a missionary in Canada. Then he moved to England. He tried to become a priest in England. He ended up as an MP for Darlington, so he was a member of Parliament. And then he worked for Rowntree, who was a massive industrialist. He went around Europe, and then he became a spy, and he was imprisoned in New York for spying, and then went to jail in London, and eventually he ended up in China, where he became a Buddhist monk. You couldn't make this stuff up, right? Now, you may think Trebitsch Lincoln is just a crazy guy. Actually, he is a reflection of something that was going on at that time, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, across the Jewish world. Enlightenment had enabled Jews to morph into completely different characters. So the example I gave in the introduction is Chaim Weizmann.
Chaim Weizmann comes from a very similar background. He's one of 13 or 15 children, and his father was a lumber merchant, and he went to Cheder, and he spoke Yiddish, and he was brought up Orthodox. And then he ends up as this urbane British scientist with a Middle European accent who's mixing with the world's top statesmen promoting Zionism. So there are two sides of the same coin. But we never look at Weizmann that way. We just see Weizmann as the urbane scientist with a little, Spitzburt, speaking with a foreign accent and mixing with statesmen. But you don't understand. That's not who he was growing up. He grew up in a cheder speaking Yiddish and having payas. So how does that happen? And through the story of a Trebitsch Lincoln, suddenly you begin to understand the incredible turmoil of the Jewish world, and by the way, the world at large. There was so much movement going on. There was people who could reinvent themselves. Somebody comes from Poland, moves to the United States of America, changes his name, and becomes a new person. And he's left his life behind him. Now we're all very busy interested in genealogy. In those days, they were interested only in forgetting their genealogy. So through these stories of mavericks and outcasts and weirdos and crazy people and false messiahs, we begin to understand the essence of the story of the mainstream, because through those extremes, it gives us a window into life as it was at that time.
The story of Trebitsch Lincoln is absolutely fantastic, and I think that what you say, you can't make this up, that sounds glib, but actually that's part of what makes all of these stories so gripping, is that they're not made up, but they seem almost more bizarre than fiction. And that brings me to a question about how did you choose these stories, right? Because there are many mavericks, there are many marginals, there are many people on the fringes of Jewish history, and yet you narrowed it down to a certain number. Well, was there something, clearly the research for each story, you say this in your conclusion, took a slightly different path, but was there something about these particular stories that have a common theme, or is there something about how you went about choosing them and conducting the research for them that you can maybe share to give a bit of an insight into your process as an author?
So I've got two answers to that question. The first is, I never choose these stories. The stories tend to choose me. So somehow, either somebody sidles up to me at the Kiddush in Shul and says, have you heard about this guy? Occasionally I have to say I have. More often than not, I say, no, I haven't heard about that fellow. You must read this book. And either they give me the book, lend me the book, buy me the book, tell me to buy the book. I go on Amazon. My wife and children say, what, you've got another book? Really? And I read through the book and I discover these crazy characters. Sometimes I have to do the research. I hear a name, I see something in a book, some allusion to some weird event, in particular the story of Lord George Gordon, which is in the book, came to me that way because I was reading a biography of William Pitt, who was the Prime Minister. William Pitt the Younger was the youngest Prime Minister ever of Great Britain. He was Prime Minister for decades. And he died quite young, actually. I don't think maybe he was 50 when he died. And anyway, he took over the British government after the collapse of the previous government of Lord North. Lord North presided over a government which had seen a terrible spate of riots, particularly against the repeal of the Catholic restrictions against Catholics in Great Britain. And the riots were named the Gordon Riots. They were the worst riots in peacetime ever in the history of Great Britain at that time. I don't know, perhaps ever. I remembered that name, Gordon. I knew the name Gordon. And I just made a mental note. I must research Lord Gordon, who presided over these riots. Anyway, this was the summer. I was reading the book as it was part of my summer reading, a pile of books which I was reading in the summer. And I get home, and of course, it's Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Kippur, it's Sukkot, and eventually after Sukkot, I decided I'm going to look into Lord George Gordon. I had made a note, and I researched him online, and I discovered that Lord George Gordon, who was this very intense and fanatic Protestant who hated Catholics, converted to Judaism and became a full-fledged Orthodox Jew and wore the garb of a Polish Chassid. And then he was jailed, and he died in jail in London, in Newgate Jail. So I'm researching online, and I see that there's a book that was published by his secretary, which describes his life. There's one available. One of these books is available online at some second-hand book dealer in Jennekwelt, I think near Bristol, which is quite far from London. I called the guy up. I said, "How much do you want for the book?" He says, "I want £125. It's a lot of money. Okay, the book is published in the late 1700s. There's only one copy. I called up a Hasidic book dealer in North London, in Stamford Hill. A friend of mine, his name is Moshe Leib Weiser. I said, "Mr. Weiser, I've just had the offer of buying a book about Lord George Gordon, and this is the price for the book. It's £125. Do you think I should buy the book?" He said, "It's not really my area of expertise, but do you mind me asking, why are you inquiring about this book today?" I said, "No, but just randomly. I read the book in the summer, and it mentioned Gordon. I want to discover more about him. I want to buy this book." He says, "Do you know that this morning we took a bus from Stamford Hill in North London to the West End of London, and we visited the site of Lord George Gordon's burial because it's his yahrzeit today." So sometimes the stories choose you, and you discover that you were meant to find them. That's the first answer. The second answer is, I have dozens more, and perhaps together we can negotiate with Matthew.
Yeah.
And we can publish volume 2 and 3 and 4, because believe me, it's not just these 7 episodes and characters who I could describe in a book. There are many, many more, all of whom have something to offer in terms of learning about Jewish history and history in general.
I have no doubt. I want to ask you a little bit more about the particular characters. So you introduced us a bit to Lord Gordon. I admit, the only personality that you look into in your book that is somebody that I'd read about before, that I knew anything about before in any depth, I mean, beyond just a few mentions here and there, was Shabbtai Tzvi, who is maybe the most famous maverick that you deal with. So Shabbtai Tzvi was a false messiah, right? He was somebody grew up in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century and came to believe that he was the Messiah, and you sort of give a much more riveting account of his life than those that I'd read previously. But nonetheless, many of the contours are more or less known. I'm curious, though, you talk a bit about sort of your own interpretation of this, of Shabbtai Tzvi and the significance of Shabbtai Tzvi. And I would like you to share that a little bit tonight. Why do you think the Shabbtai Tzvi story is important for readers today? What can we learn from this story? Is it merely a warning not to follow false messiahs, or is there something deeper about his own trajectory that you think is significant?
So I think he's actually, as a person, quite insignificant. So even though he was very bright and charming and fairly charismatic, essentially he was crazy. Gershom Scholem claims that he was schizophrenic, but who wants to read Gershom Scholem's book? It's 1,000 pages. But he has got this whole, psychiatric evaluation of Shabbtai Tzvi. But either way, I think he's almost marginal to the story. He happens to be the foil of a much bigger issue, which was to what extent mainstream Judaism can embrace things which are beyond the pale and include them in the general life of Jewish observance or Jewish community. And he pushed the boundaries to the limit, to the extent, and this is one of the other episodes in the book, that at a later date, almost 100 years later, Rabbi Yaakov Emden could attack a one of the most senior rabbis of Europe, Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz, for being a follower of Shabbtai Tzvi, just on the mere fact that some of the amulets he was giving out could potentially contain Sabbatean references, because if that's the case, it could undermine Judaism as a whole, and the whole of Judaism could fall apart. That fear for the integrity of Jewish life and Jewish observance and of how one conducts oneself as a Jew only resulted from this very extreme episode. By the way, Shabbtai Tzvi wasn't the interesting one here. The really interesting character is Nathan of Gaza. Nathan of Gaza was what we would call in classical Hebrew a Rasha. He was a very wicked man who manipulated this poor, very disturbed individual into believing he was the Messiah, and then became his prophet, wrote correspondence all over Europe to convince people that he discovered the Messiah who was going to come and save the Jews and bring them out of exile back into the land of Israel. And Nathan of Gaza and the people who followed him, who were populists and publicists for this very skewed and warped version of Kabbalah, were the grave danger to Jewish life. And the thing about Kabbalah is, if it's not in the hands of somebody who's responsible, Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. So ideas which, if you don't know who you're talking to, could be true or could not be true. You've got no idea. If somebody points at an apple and says, if you eat this apple on Wednesday, then you're going to have children, and you believe that this man is a holy man, then suddenly the power of that individual over you is incredibly strong. So people can misuse mysticism in such a way that it can undermine the fabric of community life, of Jewish life. And that was the danger of Shabbtai Tzvi. He was so mesmerizing as this messianic figure that he was able to completely throw Jewish life in Europe and elsewhere into complete chaos. And the protective measures that were taken to ensure that no such Messiah could ever emerge again and be taken seriously were such that, you know what? Since Shabbtai Tzvi, there has never been a messianic figure like him again, and there couldn't be, because they would not be taken seriously. To that extent, Shabbtai Tzvi, marginal figure that he was, is extremely important to the way we observe our life as Jews in the 21st century.
And I think that the little taste of the afterlife of the Sabbatean controversies that you gave us just now about the Emden Eibeschutz saga, maybe is a good word to describe it, really does show just how destabilizing Shabbtai Tzvi was. And I have to say, I have many favorite parts of the book, but the chapter that I found the most riveting and that I literally could not put down until I'd finished it, even though I stayed up way past my normal bedtime reading it, was the chapter on the Emden Eibeschutz controversy. So first, before I ask you more about it, maybe just say a little bit more. So you said it's about these Sabbatean amulets, but give us a sense of who was Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was Rabbi Eibeschutz, and how did they get embroiled in this controversy in the first place?
So you see here, there's the graphic, which is taken from an 18th century German book. And it's a woodcut of two rabbis arguing over the veracity of amulets. And of course, the amulets here are blown up to massive size. But amulets were tiny pieces of parchment or paper that were written by Kabbalists and given generally to people who were sick, but usually to pregnant women, so that they could have their babies safely and not die in childbirth, and that the babies would survive into childhood. And, I'm guessing, I don't know, that there weren't that many people who were considered great experts in Kabbalah who could compose these amulets, which I would imagine were put in little lockets and hung around the neck. And Rabbi Doner and Eibeschutz was one of those people. He was, without any question, the A-list rabbi of Europe. He was a star. He was a great Talmudist. He was incredibly good-looking. I mean, this is a picture of him when he was older, but he was a good-looking man. He was an excellent speaker. You know, there's one of my favorite Sforim, it's 2 volumes, of drush, of homiletic interpretations of the Torah, is a book by Rabbi Doner and Eibeschutz, which was put together after his life, called Yarot Dvash. It's an excellent book, and it's divided into sections of drashot, of sermons that he gave through his career. I give sermons. If I gave any of those sermons, I don't think I'd last another week at the shul. Not because they're bad, they are brilliant, but not one of them took less than 4 hours to give. This was a man who could stand up in front of hundreds of people, thousands of people, and speak for 4 or 5 hours without an intermission, and not one person would leave the room. That's how charismatic he was. And he was a rabbi in Prague, then he became the chief rabbi in Metz, which is in Alsace, and then he was appointed to replace the recently departed chief rabbi of Hamburg, Altona, and Wandsbek, Ahu. This was the triple community which was on the border of Denmark. It was just between Denmark. There was no Germany in those days. It was principalities, but it was, and it's on water. If you've ever been to Hamburg, it's full of these inlets of water. Today it's all Germany, but in those days it was a border city. And he was invited, this A-list rabbi is invited to become the chief rabbi of what is one of the most prominent communities of Europe. And as he's on his way, rumors begin to swirl that he is, in fact, a follower of Shabbtai Tzvi, who had died, and we're talking, this was 1750. Shabbtai Tzvi died in 1676. And on what they based their, I'll explain to you, that they based their suspicions on the fact that in the year 1725, there had been a follower of Shabbtai Tzvi's Kabbalistic system who had been caught trying to promote Sabbateanism in a community in Germany, and they found a manuscript in his luggage. And the manuscript was heresy by any standard, talking about God dying and things like that. And they said, who wrote this manuscript? Because it was anonymous. There was no name on it. He said, Emden and Eibeschutz in Prague. And they went round to a bunch of people who were followers of Shabbtai Tzvi. They sort of caught them in this dragnet, and they all agreed that Shabbtai Tzvi is the principal Sabbatean leader of Europe. In 1725, he was 35 years old. He was forced, as a result, to make a public declaration in the main synagogue in Prague that not only does he not follow Shabbtai Tzvi, but he repudiates any of the teachings of Shabbtai Tzvi's followers and publicists, etc. But the rumors persisted. And he arrives in Hamburg, and there's another titan of a rabbi living in Hamburg whose father had briefly been one of the chief rabbis of Hamburg, going back 40 years. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. His father was Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, who was without any doubt the greatest rabbi of Europe in his day. And Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi had fought against Sabbateans in Amsterdam. And in fact, he was forced to leave in 1714. He ended up in Lemberg, which is today called Lviv, and he was buried there. He died at the age of 58. I just want to tell you this because it's so sad. He was buried in the cemetery in Lviv, and before the Second World War, this was a place of pilgrimage. People used to go and visit his graveside to pray there. At some point after the Second World War, Stalin had the entire graveyard removed and built some type of shopping mall or some type of public conference center on top of the graveyard, so it's no longer there. Rabbi Yaakov Emden wasn't a rabbi of a synagogue or of a city. He was a businessman. He briefly tried to be a rabbi for 6 years. That's why he was called Rabbi Yaakov Emden, because he was the rabbi of a city called Emden on the border of Holland and Germany. And he had decided that the rabbinate wasn't for him because he just couldn't manage with all the shenanigans of a community. And he therefore became a businessman. He sold precious jewels, and he bought his own printing press. And he had a printing press in the cellar of his house. There was a bunch of people who brought him the amulets that Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz had given to pregnant women in Metz. And he opened them up, and he didn't know that they were written by Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz, or so he claimed later. And he said, whoever wrote these amulets is a follower of Shabbtai Tzvi. And the community went nuts, and he was banished. He had to run away. He was frightened for his life. It turned into a massive court case in front of the King of Denmark. It's one of the most remarkable stories of modern Jewish history, how these two great rabbis got caught in this battle over whether or not Sabbateanism was creeping into mainstream Jewish life, and nobody won. So, I don't know if you actually made it through to the end of the chapter, however late at night it was. Absolutely. But it doesn't end with a climax. No. It's a bit of an anticlimax, the ending, because it ended with a bit of a whimper. But what it did do was the incredible fury with which Rabbi Yaakov Emden fought against Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz, and anyone who came to even his slightest defense, meant that Sabbateanism was buried forever. And there was no way that anybody who considered themselves a mainstream Jew, certainly not a rabbi, could ever introduce Sabbatean ideas into the common language, the vernacular of Jewish life. And that was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Now, he himself, unfortunately, had a bit of a sad end. He lost all his money, and it was quite a tragic end. Although the beginning of the chapter is quite fascinating, and I'll leave that for the people who have the book to read. The beginning of the chapter is absolutely fascinating, but which talks about Rabbi Yaakov Emden's death scene. But the story is the epitome of how a battle over something which seems unimportant actually created the possibility for Jewish life to continue undisturbed, uninterrupted, contaminated by something which could undermine the very fabric of what it meant to be a Jew.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really comes through, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier about the importance of bringing history to life precisely by paying attention to the characters who made history. Right? History isn't just a bunch of names and dates. And you really do get the impression reading this chapter that Emden, that these were both giants, intellectual giants, authorities, really, but that they had maybe opposite personalities. Emden was unforgiving. He was inflexible. He was sort of like a crusader for the truth, unwilling to make compromises. Eibeschutz was gregarious and charismatic and outgoing and could, spellbind a shul for hours, giving his divrei Torah. And that, I think, is part of the magic of reliving this controversy, right? Is that precisely it wasn't just a few amulets and a few letters and,
It wasn't a technical matter.
Exactly.
It became about personalities.
Yes.
And there were people whose careers were made and whose careers were lost as a result of this story. I always say, because I've written about Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz for many years in different contexts. I always comment that if I would have lived in Hamburg in the 1750s, and I would have had two invitations for Friday night dinner, either to go to Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz or Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I definitely would have gone to Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz. Whether or not he was a Sabbatean, it's of no relevance, because the man was so charismatic and it's such a warm personality. Most of the next generation of rabbis in Europe considered themselves to be his disciples. Most of his books were not written by him. He wrote two books in his lifetime that were published. One of them, the first book he wrote, was a defense against Rabbi Yaakov Emden, which came out in 1755, by which time he was 65 years old. It was the first book he ever published. And the second book he published, which was in 1763, which is a year before he died, is called Kreti or Pleti. It's on one of the parts of Shulchan Aruch. All the other books that have been published in his name were either developed by his children and family out of manuscripts that he'd left behind, or were written from memory by his disciples who remembered the incredible teachings that he'd shared with them. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was the exact opposite. He published dozens of books during his lifetime, books and pamphlets. They were all written by him. He has the most incredible Hebrew. He was a classicist. He loved classical Hebrew. His Hebrew is so flowery and full of allusions to biblical texts and Talmudic texts. You know that Sir Isaac Newton is famous for having written the science about gravity, right? Do you know he spent most of his life as an alchemist? Most of his writings in manuscripts are about alchemy. Of course, nobody ever reads them, because who's interested in alchemy if you're a scientist? Most of Rabbi Yaakov Emden's books are about Rabbi Doner and Eibeschutz. The vast majority of his literary output is about his nemesis, to whom he refers to in the most vile language. I have an uncle who lives in Manchester. He gives the main Daf Yomi Shir in Manchester. I had all the publications, so I've sold some of them since then, of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And I had them in my shelf. He once came to London, and he spent an afternoon with us. And after about an hour of chatting to me about this and that, he says to me, "I've heard that you have Rabbi Yaakov Emden's Sforim in this house. Is it true?" I said, "Yes, I have." He said, "Do you mind if I look at them?" So I took them out. Well, I can't remember how many there were. There were 10 books. And he takes the book and he looks. "How can you have this in your house?" So of course he read the whole thing. How can you, 2 hours later, he's still looking at it. "How can you have this in your house?" Because Rabbi Yaakov Emden speaks with such animosity towards Rabbi Doner and Eibeschutz, or anyone who supported him. And it's almost painful to see how angry he was, considering the works which are well known of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He's got 2 very well-known works, one of them on the Siddur. The Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Emden is one of the classic commentaries on the daily prayers and the prayers of the whole year that we have in Jewish literature. And he's got a book of responsa called She'ilat Yavitz, which he, very interesting, very, very unique responses to halachic questions. For example, one of the things he allows is abortion. He says in very difficult circumstances, which he described, and in those days, what could abortion have been? But he was prescient in that he understood that there may come a time when abortion is available, and it's something that may help people, and he permits it. Now, I'm not going to tell you that all the rabbis of his time agreed with him or since, but that was the level of scholar that he was, and the level of confidence that he had in his own scholarship. And yet, like Sir Isaac Newton, he wasted so much time, he would have thought not, with Rabbi Doner and Eibeschutz. Imagine what his literary output might have been had he not had to focus, in his view at least, on the battle that he had with the Rabbi of Hamburg, trying to get him deposed.
And yet, as you said, Sabbatinism was a live threat to the Jewish community.
It was
and
obliterated as a result of this battle.
Exactly. And in some ways, I think this is part of what I appreciate so much about the book, is that it brings to life a time in Jewish history that's really hard to connect to, actually, in so many ways. And it's not just about the threat of Sabbatinism, though I think that's part of it. I mean, it's almost like, well, what was the last time a Jew declared himself Messiah? Right? Christianity. So you can imagine that Jews would have been worried about another Jew who many other Jews believed was the Messiah. But nonetheless, I think that more broadly, you bring to life a kind of vibrancy of these Jewish questions and also these halachic questions. And so I want to go to one more episode, and then maybe I'll ask you just a few concluding questions. Another one of my favorite chapters was on the Get of Cleves, right? So get is a divorce bill in Jewish law, right? That's the only way that you can get divorced, is that the husband has to deliver a get to his wife. And this is a truly fascinating episode. It's another one of these long, drawn-out controversies that has a very kind of convoluted end. In some ways, maybe even more convoluted and dramatic than the end to the Emden and Eibeschutz controversy. But it all comes down to the question of what is the halachic definition of mental illness? And was this particular husband in question mentally ill according to halakha when he delivered the get, or can he be considered to be sane? So in your conclusion, you say something about how you came to the story of the Get of Cleves. You should all read the story for yourselves, but I think it would be interesting to say something about that now, just to give a sense of the continued relevance of these halachic questions today.
Well, about 20 years ago, I became very involved in activism to help agunot, who couldn't obtain a get from their husband, to obtain get from their husband. And there were, I don't remember the exact number of open cases at the London Beth Din at that time, and we began a campaign to name and shame husbands who wouldn't give their wives a get for no good reason. You know, the first 12 months, 18 months of a separation can sometimes be very difficult, and there can be situations where, you know, the negotiations go the wrong way for one party and they use their leverage in another area to get an advantage for themselves. But eventually, it's clear that a marriage has broken down and the husband has to give a get. So after 2 or 3 years have passed, and this woman, the wife, can't remarry Jewishly unless she has a get, and the husband is still holding out for whatever reason they give, and the Beth Din declares them as refusing to give a get. So we, you know, it was not just me, it was a bunch of people in London who got involved in helping people, women, obtain a get from their recalcitrant husbands. There was one such case which was brought to my attention. Obviously, I became, you know, I was phoned regularly by people who sought my help, not all of them genuine. And this case was genuine. The husband was absolutely refusing to give his wife a get, and there was a child involved. In any event, I called up the husband, and he worked at a fairly prominent Jewish business in northwest London, and I said, I have 100 people who are ready to come and demonstrate outside your place of business every single day until you give a get. And we're going to walk around with placards, and we're going to say, whatever his name was, refuses to give his wife a get, don't go to this fine establishment. Well, he got a bit of a shock. He said, you can't do that. I said, yes, I can. I can get a permit from the police, and we can do it. Of course we can. So he says, okay, I'll call you back. He didn't call me back. A friend of his called me back. He says, do you know that my friend, this husband who won't give a get, has a history of having psychiatric problems? And if you don't back off, we, friends and family, are going to say that he's not capable of giving his wife a get because he's going to plead insanity. And she will never be able to receive a get and will never be able to remarry. I was very taken aback. Now, I knew the halachot, but that was something that really, I mean, that's quite scary that somebody would be willing to do that publicly to punish their wife. I called up my uncle. I have an uncle in London with whom I used to learn a lot. And I said to him, this is what's happened. So he says, don't take any notice. You don't have to worry about it. I said, what are you talking about? He said, have you ever heard of the Get of Cleves? I said, no, I've heard of Anne of Cleves. She was married to Henry VIII. You know, I was in my head, I was thinking Henry VIII got divorced. There must be something in. So he said, no, it's nothing to do with Anne of Cleves. The Get of Cleves. Go and research the Get of Cleves. He gave me the name of the book to look at, and I researched the Get of Cleves. And the Get of Cleves is a very interesting story. The young couple gets married. It's 1767 or 66 in Germany. And this young couple gets married, and unfortunately, during the course of the wedding week, the husband displays quite a number of signs of paranoia, possibly schizophrenia. Of course, they don't know how to diagnose it in those days. And eventually, they find themselves in a situation where this young couple are together with the wife's family, with this young girl's family, in a particular place, and the young man, the husband, says, I want to divorce immediately. Why do you want to divorce? He says, because I'm being chased, people are chasing after me, they want to kill me, I need to escape. Really, who's chasing after you? I can't tell you. Of course, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. Or something like that. What do you want us to do? I mean, where are we going to find someone to arrange a get? Anyway, they end up in this small town called Cleves. Mm-hmm. And the rabbi of Cleves was a scholar. I'm sure he wasn't the most prominent rabbi in Europe, but he was a scholar. And they arrive on his doorstep, a whole bunch of them. They say, we want you to arrange for the divorce for this couple. When they get married 2 weeks ago. What are you talking about? We need a divorce right away. He arranges the divorce. He speaks to the young man. Do you know what you're doing? I know exactly what I'm doing. Do you understand what it means to get divorced? Of course I understand what it means to get divorced. And there's other people in the room, and they observe this. He gives the get, and he disappears, and he runs away. I mean, if you disappear, where do you go? London. So he runs away to London. And there he is, and this girl gets divorced, but he hasn't told his parents, and his parents find out, and they go crazy. You know that my father had a rabbi, a teacher in London, who used to say that 90% of the world's problems have got to do with money, and the other 10% have also got to do with money. And of course, this young man's parents had given a lot of money to the young man, and they were very dissatisfied with the financial arrangements in this separation. So they roped in their rabbi, who then wrote to the rabbinate of Frankfurt to nullify the get on the basis that this young man was crazy. And I won't go into the details, you can read it in the book. The whole of Europe erupted around this story. And in the end, it became a story not just about insanity and the Jewish legal definition of insanity, which in itself is interesting. It became a battle about jurisdiction. Who has the right to step in to an existing legal case and give their decision, their legal decision, and that they have to be listened to? And this is, by the way, a flyer that was issued about the Get of Cleves by the Frankfurt Rabbinate, in which, if you look there in the larger letters towards the bottom, it talks about one of the people who was involved in arranging the get. And they call him Hamesit Umediach, the person who is trying to lead people astray, Shimon Copenhagen. And they totally dismiss his authority to have been involved. Asher hu mefrusam besod besachkim shel lombri spieler. He is a renowned gambler. Mm-hmm. That's what it says there. This is the way they attacked their interlocutor in this halachic dispute. But this was a matter of jurisdiction. The Frankfurt Rabbinate insisted that they had the right to determine whether the get was legal, was valid, or was not valid. And this battle erupted and went on for years. But as a result of more or less every other rabbi in Europe agreeing that the get was valid, the legal definition of insanity in terms of giving a get was decided, and it applies to this day. So my uncle told me, don't you worry if they have him declared psychiatrically unstable, because as long as we can prove that he understands what a get is, he can give a get. He can go to Beit Din and give a get. Well, I called back this friend of the family, and I said, I have it on very good authority that it makes no difference if you publicly declare your friend to be insane, because he can still give his wife a get, and I'll have it in writing within 24 hours, signed by the London Beth Din. There was a long silence on the phone. Within 24 hours, this woman had a get. So you see that a story as obscure as the Get of Cleves had real ramifications for a divorce story in late 20th century London.
Yeah. I want to ask you Just in concluding, to reflect a little bit about your personal background and your personal evolution. And again, this is maybe referring to something Matthew said at the very beginning, which is that some of these unsavory characters might be considered a little surprising or even somewhat controversial for an Orthodox rabbi to write a whole book about, right? So I'm wondering, to what extent does writing this book sort of represent a break with the tradition in which you grew up? To what extent do you see it as very much following in that path?
I don't see it as a contradiction, although I must admit that no one else has written a book like this. So clearly it's an original idea to take these characters and put them together in a collection of stories. And I really have done it in such a way that somebody who is not an academic can access these stories in a way that's going to, it's compelling reading even if you're not a historian. And I've done that deliberately. I think that it's not a contradiction, but it is unusual. I have a very large collection, I think it's the largest in the world, of Jewish polemics and publications relating to controversies. There is something that you see regularly. It's almost like a mantra that appears at the beginning of every single polemic I own, which is, it's a paragraph that goes something like this, in Hebrew or English or Yiddish or German or any language, something like this. I'm paraphrasing. Whoever's writing it says as follows: I'm not an argumentative person. I've never been involved in controversy before in my entire life. I'm a peace-loving individual, but circumstances compel me to do something about this terrible and disastrous event that's happened or person that's in our community. I think that what really drives me to these stories is the passion of the people who are involved. Imagine Rabbi Yaakov Emden's passion to defrock a fellow rabbi because he was concerned about heresy. Imagine the passion of the Frankfurt Bet Din to issue a flyer where they refer to a fellow rabbi as a gambler. Imagine the type of personalities that engage in these activities, and it jumps out of you off the page. And what's so wonderful it is about these things is that it's a fellow Jew, it's Jewish history, it's something we can relate to. It's not Napoleon, and it's not Alexander the Great. It's a rabbi. I saw his name in a Dvar Torah that came out on a flyer that was in my shul last week. And it's a personality who I've heard of. It's Shabbtai Tzvi, and it's not just a history. It's a story, it's passion, it's energy, it's a vibe. And that really, I think, is, that's the excitement that I get when I study a piece of Talmud. And that's the excitement that I want to convey through the pages of this book and in so much that I write. The excitement and the vibrancy and the energy that's contained in Jewish people who care about their faith and care about who they are and care about their origins and care about their history. And that is such an incredibly powerful narrative for a Jew who may be struggling with their identity or struggling to find that passion in their own Jewish life. And it's related here through these aberrant stories of strange people, but in the end, the topics don't change. And, it may be a different century and a different era and a different topic, but the same excitement exists in this shul, in every community, and in every Jewish home. I think I've said it to you before, that I had a teacher in yeshiva. He was a Rosh Yeshiva. He said, there's only one thing that two Jews can agree upon, and that's what the third one should be giving to charity. And it's that energy which I like to capture.
We want to make sure that we have some time for the audience to ask questions, so I'll open it up, and I believe there's a mic. I believe this microphone.
Yes, somebody's going to have to come and take the mic round. Thank you.
Yes.
Hold on, wait till you get the mic.
Yes, otherwise people won't be able to hear you.
And this is being recorded, so we want to be able to hear you in the recording as well. Thank you.
Yes, up there.
Hi,
Rabbi
Marcus.
Rabbi Doner, thank you for a really nourishing and really, really interesting presentation. Looking forward to reading the book. From your research and from the various stories, what might be your sort of favorite practical Torah lesson that we could take into our life from the amazing characters and the breadth of the research that you've done?
I'm not sure that it's a Torah lesson, although it's a good life lesson. Don't take things at face value. So I'll give you an example. There's another episode in the book about Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg, who published a Haggadah, which he claims was based on a manuscript and was the Haggadah of the Maharal of Prague. And it's a forgery. And if you'd see a picture, I don't have a picture here in this PowerPoint presentation of Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg, you wouldn't imagine that this man could ever produce a forgery of the Maharal's Haggadah. And yet, he did. And not only that, he went on to invent all the stories that you've ever heard about the Golem of Prague. And don't take everything you see seriously unless it's been verified and vetted. And I think that applies across the board. You know that the Ramban was in a dispute with Pablo Cristiani. It was in the 13th century, and Pablo Cristiani was a convert from Judaism to Catholicism, and they challenged the Ramban to a debate to prove that Christianity had replaced Judaism. And in order to refute certain elements of Judaism and prove that Christianity was correct, Pablo Cristiani quoted a midrash. And the Ramban patiently listened as Pablo Cristiani regaled the audience, which included the king of Aragon, with this midrash that proved that he was right and Judaism was wrong and the Ramban was an idiot. And when he was finally over, the Ramban said to him, "Of course the midrash exists, but we're taught that you can't take a midrash seriously. And therefore, if there's something in the midrash that undermines the context of Judaism and the practice of Judaism, the observance of Judaism, it's just there to teach you some Mussar lesson, maybe some ethical lesson, and we have to examine the midrash in that perspective." So I think that if the Ramban can say it about a midrash, we should certainly be more discerning if somebody declares themselves to be a Messiah, or if somebody publishes a book and says something in that book that we don't particularly feel to be correct. You know, I'm thinking now of people who say that they know why the Holocaust happened. You know, every year you read an article about some rabbi who's declared that now last week we heard why it was that there was a massacre in the Tree of Life shul in Pittsburgh. You know, there's a rabbi in Brooklyn who declared that he knows why it happened. He has no idea. And we need to be more discerning. Just because a rabbi speaks up about something, unless it's been vetted and verified, treat it with a pinch of salt.
In the back.
Hold
Oh,
on,
wait,
wait
hold
till you
on
get
one
to the
second.
microphone.
Hi there. What are the defensive measures we've taken against another Tzvi making an appearance?
Shabbtai Tzvi, thank you, Paul. The defensive measures are not overt. So I can't point to this or that and say, this is why Shabbtai Tzvi can never happen again. I can just tell you, as someone who was brought up in the most traditional setting of an Orthodox home and in an Orthodox community, that if somebody like Shabbtai Tzvi appeared, not in every aspect, even in some of the aspects of Shabbtai Tzvi, and declared himself to be a Messiah based on the type of things that he was doing and suggesting were correct for him to do, that there's not one person I grew up with, neither rabbi nor ordinary common folk who would ever accept him as the Messiah. Now, I can't explain to you why. We can relive this narrative through the pages of my book, and we can read the story about Emden and Eibeschutz, and we can understand that clearly this was a danger then, but it's not a danger now, and it would never happen. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be some other danger to Jewish life. And there have been since that period of time. You know, there's never been an era without a controversy in Judaism and within Jewish life. You know, the creation of the State of Israel created this incredible, controversial polemic against Zionists and Zionism that still persists to this day. You know, and how are we to relate to that? Well, I guess, after 70, it's going to be 71 years after Pesach, we can say that those who refused to accept the existence of the State of Israel got it wrong. Now, it doesn't mean that their fears were wrong. Perhaps their fears were correct, and perhaps the State of Israel somehow morphed into something which worked, and that there's a framework of Judaism and Jewish life within the State of Israel that enables it to be acceptable. And that might not have happened had the opposition not existed. It's hard to pin down. That's something for a PhD thesis. But it's certainly the case that there's no one who could point to the Jewish state, to the State of Israel, and say, that's a danger to Judaism. That's not going to happen anymore. Now, what's the new danger? I don't know. I'm sure one will emerge, and then we'll respond to it in kind. But I can tell you that based on the story of Shabbtai Tzvi and the really crazy things that he did and his supporters did, that no such Messiah could ever emerge again and be taken seriously by any kind of general public within the Jewish world. Hold on, wait for the microphone.
Here it is, it's coming.
Thank you. This is Ernie.
I'd like to know what during Shabbtai Tzvi to become a Muslim.
Yes, that's quite scary. So Shabbtai Tzvi converted to Islam. He was confronted by the Sultan of Turkey. The Sultan of Turkey said to him, "You're not the Messiah." It reminds me of the line from Monty Python's Life of Brian. "You're not the Messiah, you're a very naughty boy." Yes, well, you can either be beheaded or you can convert to Islam. Well, guess what? Shabbtai Tzvi valued his head more than his religion, and he converted to Islam. But he was a little crazy. So even though he converted to Islam, he still considered himself a Jew. And he would run little prayer circles until the Sultan forbade him and eventually banished him to Montenegro, where he died. But he was not a sane individual, and therefore his conversion to Islam, the only thing it managed to achieve is to convince everybody that he was insane. But as far as he was concerned, it made no difference if he was a Muslim or a Buddhist or secular or Jewish, and it made no difference to him. He was crazy. Yes. There's a question up there. Esther.
Just leafing through your book, are you going to do parts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10?
Well, earlier on I said, I was asked whether or not I chose these stories specifically, and I said there's many more such stories, so we'll have to have subsequent volumes which include the many additional stories of characters and controversies from the Jewish world. We'll have to go into negotiation with the publisher. Thank you. Are there any more questions?
I want to take this opportunity
I'll
to
do it.
have everyone in the congregation and your friends to congratulate you on this wonderful achievement.
Thank you. Thank you again all for coming. Thank you so much to Jessica.
It's been such a
what a
pleasure.
fantastic job. And thank you for being here. I know that some of you still want books. There's books available outside. I can dedicate them. I can sign them if you're willing to wait a little bit. And hopefully we'll see you in a month's time when the title of my lecture will be The Short and Extraordinary Life of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Thank you again.